In this video, I offer what I think to be the 5 most important things for you to know about the Gospel of Mark. We'll start at number 5 and work our way down to number 1. Number 5. The Gospel of Mark is traditionally symbolized by a lion. There are 2 visionary passages in the Bible in which the following 4 animals feature prominently: human, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. The 2 passages are Revelation 4:7 and Ezekiel 1:4 through 10. Revelation likely borrows its imagery from Ezekiel, as the New Testament often quotes or alludes to text from the Old Testament. In the vision in Ezekiel, the prophet sees 4 different living creatures, and each of these creatures has 4 faces. One is the face of a human, one the face of a lion, one the face of an ox, and one the face of an eagle. Each of these 4 creatures would come to be associated with one of the 4 canonical Gospels, as depicted here in the Book of Kells. The images were associated with each Gospel based on what happens at the beginning of each Gospel, and the imagery was then used as a teaching tool for remembering central themes and topics unique to each Gospel. Matthew was associated with the human, Mark was associated with the lion, Luke associated with the ox, and John was associated with the eagle. The Gospel of Matthew begins with a human genealogy of Jesus. A list of 42 humans, beginning with Abraham and ending with Jesus, opens the Gospel. Based on this beginning, the Gospel of Matthew is associated with the human creature from Ezekiel and Revelation. Pedagogically, this association reminds us that in Matthew, Jesus is depicted as a human teacher and is related to other important humans from Israel's past, especially King David and Moses. After its introductory remarks in the first 4 verses, Luke begins its narrative by centering the priestly character Zechariah, who is John the Baptist's father. Oxen were sacrificial animals associated with priests. Because Luke begins with the priest, it was associated with the ox from Revelation and Ezekiel. One thematic element of Luke is that Jesus slowly plods towards his sacrificial death in Jerusalem, just as an ox might slowly plod its way to its sacrificial death. The Gospel of John begins by soaring to the heights of Christology with its poetic prologue, just as an eagle soars high above the earth. Throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus is clearly and closely associated with the Jewish God, with devices such as the I am sayings that recall the revelation of the divine name from Exodus chapter 3. The Gospel of Mark begins not with Jesus, but with John the Baptist, who's loudly proclaiming a baptism in a deserted place, just as a lion loudly roars on the open plains. The Gospel of Mark moves more quickly than any of the other Gospels. Jesus moves from location to location to location, doing various kinds of powerful deeds, just as a lion powerfully bounds about. The lion thus serves as Mark's image. With the Gospel of Mark, we have a fast-moving narrative in which Jesus regularly performs powerful deeds. Number 4. The Gospel of Mark was the first written gospel. By most scholarly counts, the Gospel of Mark was written just before or just after 70 CE. The destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans tends to be the pivot point for dating the Gospel. The first Jewish temple was built by King Solomon in the 10th century and has stood for approximately 400 years before it was destroyed by the Babylonians in one of the most important and devastating events in Jewish history: the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, which was accompanied by the exile to Babylon. Very shortly thereafter, however, the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persian Empire, and the Persians repatriated Jews, allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild both the city and the temple. By about 515 BCE, just 70 years after the first temple was destroyed, the second Jewish temple was rebuilt, the account of which is recorded in Ezra and Nehemiah. The Second Temple was enlarged by the Jewish Hasmonean kings in the 2nd century BCE and then underwent an extensive remodel and beautification under the rule of Herod the Great in the years immediately preceding Jesus' birth. In the year 70 CE, the temple was destroyed by the Romans, putting an end to Jewish revolt and war against Rome. The future Roman Emperor Titus squelched Jewish rebellion in Jerusalem, ultimately destroying the temple and city of Jerusalem on August 30th of 70 CE, as the Babylonians had done 600 years earlier. The Gospel of Mark may allude to the destruction of the temple in its 13th chapter. Here, the disciples are marveling at the beauty of the Jerusalem temple and the city, as well as the temple precincts. Jesus states that, quote, "Not one of the beautiful stones will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." Some scholars think that this is a pretty clear reference to the destruction of the temple that the author of Mark must have known about. Thus, it's not a prediction made by the historical Jesus, rather it's a prediction after the fact of the destruction of the temple that's put back into Jesus' mouth by the author of Mark. Other scholars don't think that Jesus' words clearly refer to the destruction of the temple or betray Mark's knowledge of it. These scholars do, however, seem to imply that trouble is brewing, and this is amplified in the rest of Mark chapter 13. For these scholars, Jesus' words in Mark 13:2 might not reveal knowledge of the destruction of the temple, but they reveal that Mark is writing during the period of the Jewish revolt against Rome that would eventually lead to the temple's destruction, even if it had not happened yet. Number 3. The Gospel of Mark is best experienced in its entirety in one sitting rather than in sections. People certainly read texts in the ancient world. It's a myth that private reading wasn't a normal activity in the New Testament context. Yet, ancient literacy and the variety of ways that people experienced narratives in the ancient world differs from modern literacy in the variety of ways that we experience narratives in the modern world. In general, ancient literacy was lower than modern literacy. We presume that most people in our context have both the ability to read and to write. This wasn't the case in the ancient context. For this reason, and others, oral traditions and oral storytelling played a larger role in passing down memories and histories then than they do today. The Gospel of Mark betrays many of the signs that are characteristic of an oral narrative in comparison to a written one. For one, Mark is the shortest of the Gospel. It takes approximately an hour and a half to read or perform aloud, and modern performances of Mark are still especially compelling. We cannot necessarily say the same thing about performances of Matthew, Luke, or John when done in their entirety. Second, Mark tends not to quote Jewish scriptures with exactitude. Instead, it alludes to them. This is because Mark doesn't expect that their audience is reading the gospel with texts of the Old Testament in hand, as if readers are cross-referencing between the two. Rather, Mark pings these texts with key words and phrases. Third, and finally, several stylistic features of Mark resemble oral storytelling in comparison to written storytelling. Mark proceeds by stating things like, "and this happened, and immediately that happened, and he says," and so on and so forth. Stringing along sentence and episodes with the word "and" is called parataxis, and it's one of the distinctive features of stories that are told orally. The same is true of the quick pace at which Mark moves in the so-called historic present, using a present tense verb for action that happened in past time. This makes the whole story feel more vivid when it's told aloud. What all of this amounts to is that the most common and compelling way to experience Mark in the ancient world, and perhaps even in the modern world, was through oral tellings of the gospel. Number 2, the Gospel of Mark has multiple endings. If you were to pause this video, and I encourage you to do this, and open any Bible to the end of Mark, you would find that the Gospel has several different endings. These are normally indicated in modern print Bibles with brackets and some kind of note explaining the different endings. Typically, the endings are put into 3 different categories, but in actuality, there are more than 3 different endings in the manuscript history of the Gospel of Mark. The 3 common endings are normally called the original ending, the shorter ending, and the longer ending. The original ending is Mark 16:8. Here, an angel announces to the women at Jesus' tomb that he's not in the tomb, but has resurrected and returned to Galilee. The angel commands the women to tell Jesus' disciples this news, but, quote, they don't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. This ending, while it's the one that appears in the best and oldest manuscripts of Mark, is also a bit unsatisfying. This is presumably why other endings were added to it, including the shorter ending, which states that the women did in fact report the news to the disciples, and the good news spread throughout the entire world. The longer ending, which consists of Mark 16:9 through 20, in which Jesus appears to other people, commissions the disciples himself, as in the Gospel of Matthew, and then tells the disciples of the various miraculous things that they're going to be empowered to do. As modern readers who are accustomed to one single version of a story, we're interested in knowing which is the right ending. And this is reflected in the label original ending for Mark 16:8. While it's true that Mark 16:8 possesses the strongest textual manuscript evidence for it, the Gospel of Mark has circulated with several different endings and still does in most of our Bibles today. Number 1. The Gospel of Mark aims to convince its audience that Jesus was a suffering Messiah. Mark presents a compelling and unique portrayal of Jesus as a suffering Messiah, a concept that was revolutionary for its time. In contrast to one of the prevalent Jewish messianic expectations, that of a triumphant political deliverer, Mark's gospel underscores the paradox of a Messiah who attains victory through suffering and death. This theme is introduced early in the narrative and is meticulously woven throughout the text, guiding the audience to a profound understanding of Jesus' mission and identity. Mark chapter 8, verses 27 through 33 are a critical point in the narrative. Here, Peter, recognizing Jesus as the Messiah, vehemently rejects the notion of a suffering Savior. Jesus' rebuke of Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things," starkly highlights the divine necessity of Jesus' suffering. Jesus' messianic identity in the Gospel of Mark can only be understood on the other side of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. It can only be understood at the end of the Gospel of Mark, after Jesus has gone through Calvary. Ultimately, Mark's Gospel challenges its audience to embrace a radical redefinition of messiahship, one that hinges on Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection.